I'd like to demonstrate a new feature in CloudStack which enables the taking of fast and efficient volume snapshots with SolidFire and XenServer. First, let's take a look at the infrastructure I have in place. I have one zone, one pod, one XenServer cluster. Both of my two XenServer clusters are running version 6.5. And I have three primary storages. Let's go take a look at those. The top one is primary storage that's based on the SolidFire storage plugin. The second and third primary storage are local primary storages, one for each of the two XenServer hosts. Now, with this top primary storage, which I'll click on now, and kind of scroll down to the bottom, we can see it's very similar to other primary storages except for in two ways. One, it's at the zone level, so it can be seen by virtual machines in multiple clusters in the zone rather. And two, it does not represent a pre-allocated volume, but rather a subset of the storage area network. So we tell CloudStack how many bytes and how much performance from this SolidFire cluster can be utilized in this zone in CloudStack. Okay, so let's go and take a look at the Instances tab. I currently have just a single virtual machine running. Its root disk is actually making use of the primary storage that's making use of the SolidFire storage plugin. So if I click on this virtual machine, click on View Volumes, we can see it has at the moment one virtual disk. This is its root disk. And since we're making use of primary storage that uses that SolidFire storage plugin, each of these virtual disks will have its own volume on the SolidFire cluster. In this case, since we only have a single virtual disk, we would expect to see just a single volume on the SolidFire cluster, assuming you're not using your cluster for other purposes, which is completely fine. You can use your SolidFire cluster both with a CloudStack environment and with other environments at the same time. In my particular case here, I'm only using it for this demonstration for a CloudStack environment, so we should only see a single SolidFire volume, and that volume is being used to house this virtual disk. So let's click on the SolidFire GUI, and we can see here we have a single volume. On the SolidFire system, it's identified with volume ID, in this case 143. It has a name which is typically the same as what you'll see in CloudStack, but there are certain characters which aren't permitted in a SolidFire volume name, which are permitted in a CloudStack volume name, so sometimes the name on the SolidFire system will be slightly different from what's visible in CloudStack. All SolidFire volumes are associated with an account. So this is a multi-tenant system from the ground up. All volumes are associated with an account. This is no different here. So we see we have an account which I'm highlighting. That account, just like in CloudStack, where CloudStack owns resources through accounts, the same concept is in play here in the SolidFire system. So if you spin up that virtual machine, we need a root disk. We go off to the SolidFire system to create it. We'll look and see if we have already an existing SolidFire account for your particular CloudStack account. And if we don't, we'll create one for you before we create the volume. And then that volume will end up being associated with the proper account. Over to the right a bit, we see that this volume is in what we call a volume access group. Volume access groups are a way of permitting hosts, like our two XenServer hosts, to have access to particular volumes on the cluster. So in this case, if I go over to the upper right and take a look at volume access groups, and right now I just have one, we'll see that there's two hosts in it, and only one volume at the time being. So we can see here 2 initiators. Our hosts are referred to as initiators here. And we have 1 volume. If I go ahead and click on that link, we're back to where we came from basically. And we can see our volume, the account, the volume access group, its size, other characteristics like access, read, write. If we go over to the quality of service, we can see its performance information, minimum IOPS, maximum IOPS, burst IOPS. And then there's also other information like volume details, which might be of interest, as well as statistics to the right. So let's switch over to XenServer and take a look at the environment from that point of view. Now right now we have 3 CloudStack system VMs. 1 I've highlighted, 2, and 3. They all just happen to be running on a single XenServer host. My one and only user virtual machine, which I've just highlighted, is running on the other XenServer host. If I take a look at its storage, we can see it just has the root disk, and it references the VDI for that root disk is on this particular shared storage repository. I'll go ahead and click on that. So when we spun up that virtual machine, we needed to create a SolidFire volume with the right size and performance characteristics. We then told XenServer to go ahead and create a new storage repository for us on that SolidFire volume. Then we created a virtual disk image as our root disk in that SR. And now our virtual machine is running with its root disk having its own performance characteristics that are backed by the SolidFire system. Okay, so let's take a volume snapshot of the root disk of this virtual machine. I'm going to click on the virtual machine in the row, go to its volumes. We see it just has this one volume, the root disk. In the far right, we have the quick view column. I can go over to that and click Take Snapshot. Now I'll go ahead and provide a name. Now typically, when you take a volume snapshot, what happens for XenServer, and we'll quickly go over to our XenServer view and take a look at the SR containing our VDI, our virtual disk image. Typically what happens is a hypervisor snapshot is taken of the VDI, and that snapshot is then copied to secondary storage. It's really more of a backup than a snapshot per se. Now in this case, what I'm going to do is make a snapshot on the SolidFire system instead of taking that VDI and copying it to secondary storage. So this will be very space efficient and very fast, and we'll see this right now. Let's go back over to the CloudStack GUI and finish up initiating the process of taking a snapshot by hitting the OK button. Now, this takes about 10 seconds, but what we're doing here is we're going through some CloudStack logic to figure out what kind of a snapshot strategy object can handle this particular situation. We find the right one. It invokes the right functionality on the storage driver for SolidFire, which takes a snapshot on the SolidFire cluster. So this is already done. Let's go ahead and take a look at the SolidFire GUI. And for our one and only volume on the system, let's go ahead first and hit refresh. We'll see right now this is the old data. There were no snapshots. Let's hit refresh. And now we can see that there is one snapshot. Let's go ahead and click on that hyperlink. And here we can see we have a snapshot. It has a name that we've given it, which is essentially, let's see here, it's the name of the volume, the SolidFire volume, followed by a dash, and then this is the UUID of the CloudStack volume snapshot. So here, this was a very fast process, very space efficient. So now that we've taken our backend snapshot for our CloudStack volume snapshot, we'd like to use it. We'd like to create a volume from that snapshot or create a template from that snapshot. The problem is with XenServer, it's not quite that simple. What happens with XenServer is that our backend volume had both an SR and a VDI on it, and both of those objects have unique identifiers. So therefore, when we took our snapshot of our volume on the back-end system, our snapshot looks at the moment identical to our volume. So therefore, the SR that's in the snapshot has the same UUID as the SR that's in the volume. And the VDI that's in the snapshot has the same UUID as the VDI that's on the volume. Before we actually make use of that snapshot, we need to actually assign a new unique identifier to our SR and our VDI. And we can get into the details of how that looks from CloudStack's perspective in a moment. But first, let's take a look at the custom storage manager software that I've installed on my XenServer 6.5 hosts to enable this kind of UUID re-signing. So I'll go over to my console, and here I've SSH'd already into one of my two XenServer hosts. I'm going to type xesm list, storage manager list, and hit enter. And then I'm going to scroll up a bit. We can see here there is a storage manager provided by CloudOps for the LVM over iSCSI type, which in this case, what this storage manager does is it takes the default LVM over iSCSI storage manager and it extends it to provide this re-signing capability. So you can look at this custom storage manager as being the same thing as the original plus this re-signing capability that we make use of so that we can actually use our backend snapshots. So let's go ahead now and create a CloudStack volume from our newly created volume snapshot. I'm in the storage tab. We're looking at the one and only virtual disk image. This is our root disk for our virtual machine. Let's go ahead and click on this row. Over in the far right, let's click on the View Snapshots hyperlink. We can see we have one volume snapshot. In the Quick View column, let's go and create a volume. We'll provide a name, vol-1, sounds good, and I'll hit the OK button. So right now, we are actually able on the SolidFire system to make a volume from our snapshot by cloning the snapshot metadata to create a new SolidFire volume. This can be a very fast process, and at that point what happens is we take that newly created volume, which, remember now, it actually has the same state as our snapshot, which means it has the same UUID for the SR as the source volume that our snapshot was taken from, and we have the same issue with the VDI. So we need to take our new SolidFire volume and hand it over to XenServer to run re-sign logic, and let's actually go over to XenCenter right now, and in a bit we will be able to see the new storage repository briefly show up. And this is just indicating that there is some activity that's being performed on that object. In this particular case, what's happening is we're re-signing the SR, the UUID of the SR, and the UUID of the VDI. And once we have two unique identifiers that are in play, we're basically done at that point. We have our new SolidFire volume on the back end, and the front end version of that is our new CloudStack volume. So here we can see we have our new, we can see vol-1 as part of its name, and in a moment this red X will disappear, and then it will come back, and then the storage repository will disappear. And the process is done. So this is a very fast process to re-sign this kind of information. Once the re-signing is done, we are essentially done. We will go back to the SolidFire storage plugin, and since nobody is actually making use of this new CloudStack volume yet, we'll make sure that we remove the access that we temporarily granted to these two XenServer hosts. We'll remove that access from the SolidFire SAN so that no one can actually access that SolidFire volume until we choose to attach that CloudStack volume to a VM. So let's go over to the SolidFire system now. And well, first of all, let's see here. In notifications, we can see that create volume was successful. So let's close this, and I'm going to click on the storage tab, and we can see here vol-1 has been created, and it is not attached to any VM. So what that means to me is that on the SolidFire system, we should not see the corresponding SolidFire volume in a volume access group. It was briefly in a volume access group while we granted the XenServer hosts in that cluster both access to the volume while one of them performed the re-sign operation. So let's go over to the SolidFire system and click on the Active Volumes tab. And we can see here we have a new SolidFire volume, and it is in the same SolidFire account as our original SolidFire volume. Now our original SolidFire volume, since this volume is supporting the root disk of our virtual machine, which is currently being accessed by one of our XenServer hosts, we see that it is in a volume access group. Both of those XenServer hosts currently have access to this SolidFire volume. Now this other SolidFire volume, which we just created, is not in a volume access group, and that's because it's not actually being used by any of the hosts in my CloudStack environment at the time being. If we were to go ahead and attach the CloudStack volume that we created to our virtual machine, then we would see that this particular SolidFire volume is in a volume access group. In fact, it would be in the same volume access group as the root-12 volume, since that's all being handled in the same XenServer cluster. And let's go ahead and take a look at snapshots. We can see here actually that nothing has changed. We still have our one and only snapshot, and when we created that CloudStack volume from our volume snapshot, what happened was we took this snapshot and we cloned its metadata into the metadata of a brand new SolidFire volume. So that was a very fast process. And at that point, we needed to go ahead and re-sign the SR and the VDI using the new software that was installed on one of our two XenServer hosts. Let's go ahead now and attach this newly created data disk to our one and only virtual machine. I'll click Attach Disk. In the resultant dialog, I'll select the one and only virtual machine that I have. And, well, actually, it's selected by default, so I'll just hit the OK button. And then we can switch over to the SolidFire GUI, and I can hit the refresh button. Now, this won't necessarily happen the first time, but at some point in the near future, well, actually, it did happen right away. We have our volume or vol-1 SolidFire volume placed in a volume access group. And again, we would expect it to be in the same volume access group as this other SolidFire volume, because this other SolidFire volume is storing the root disk of our virtual machine that we just attached our CloudStack volume to. So let's go over to XenServer, and we can see a new storage repository has shown up. This is the storage repository that's on our vol-1 SolidFire volume. If I go over to the storage tab, we can see we have a single virtual disk image within it, and it is in fact attached to the virtual machine that we expected. If we go over to that virtual machine, on its storage tab, we can see that now we no longer only have just a root disk, we also have a data disk. Let's go back over to the SolidFire GUI, and in the volume access groups area, we can see that we have 2 volumes. Now let's create a template from our volume snapshot. So let's click on root-12, go over to View Snapshots. Here's our volume snapshot. Let's go to the Quick View column and create template. We'll make up a name here, maybe just T1 DESC. I'll make it public, and in my case, it's CentOS 5664-bit. I'll hit the OK button. So let's go over to the SolidFire GUI and to the Active Volumes tab. So here again, we have our initial SolidFire volume, which is storing the root disk of our virtual machine. The SolidFire volume right below it is for our data disk. If we go over to Snapshots, we can see again, we just have our 1 snapshot. At this point, what's actually happening is we need to create a SolidFire volume via cloning again, from cloning the metadata copying the metadata of this snapshot into a new SolidFire volume. And that SolidFire volume will show up under Active Volumes. And it hasn't quite happened yet. We're still in the process of copying that metadata. But what will happen is we'll see a new SolidFire volume. And that SolidFire volume will get placed in this, I'll select it again, this volume access group that we see for these other 2 volumes. We will then go ahead and reassign the UUIDs of the SR and the VDI, then mount the SR within our XenServer environment and copy the VHD file from primary storage to secondary storage. So that will be how our template is created. Let's go ahead and hit the refresh button here again. Okay, we can see we have a new volume. And over here, it's in the same volume access group as the other 2 volumes. And since I've initiated these actions all from the same CloudStack account, all 3 of these volumes are in the same SolidFire account. We go over to XenServer, and we can see here, I'll select it. This is a new storage repository that's being brought up. Once this is completely attached to, then the control domain will go ahead. Let me switch over to the storage tab here. The control domain, that virtual machine will go ahead and copy the contents of this virtual disk image. So it's implemented as a VHD file. It will copy that VHD file to secondary storage. And then once on secondary storage, that template can be spun up as you would spin up any normal template. It's just a regular template. We can see over here, I can select it here as well. This is the SR. I'll switch over to the storage tab that represents our location on secondary storage where we're copying the VHD file to. So switching back to our source storage repository now. And once this process has completed, which is actually happening right now, we'll see that our storage repositories, both the source and the destination, have disappeared. If we go over to the SolidFire GUI, let me switch over to my browser and click on the refresh button here. We should see that the volume itself, first it was taken out of the volume access group, then this volume was actually deleted. We don't need it anymore. So it's gone. We still have our snapshot, of course, so if we need to repeat that process, we can do the same thing, create a new SolidFire volume via cloning. But right now, we don't need this volume anymore. You can kind of look at it like a temporary volume. We needed it so that we could copy that VHD file from primary storage to secondary storage. And the reason is because SolidFire snapshots cannot be mounted. They don't have their own unique IQNs, iSCSI qualified names. Only volumes in the SolidFire system have iSCSI qualified names. So that's why we needed to create a volume via cloning from our snapshot so that we could mount it within XenServer and copy from primary storage to secondary storage. So now if we go over to the CloudStack GUI, we can see here, go up to notifications, our create template was successful. I'll close that down and go over to the template section. And then we'll see here that we have some other templates, but one of which is the template that we just created. Here we are, T1. I'll click on it. And we can see here the hypervisor type is XenServer, and it has all of the characteristics that you're used to seeing for a template. It's just a regular template, and just like all templates, residing on secondary storage. Now let's create a new virtual machine using this template that we just created. I'm on the Instances tab. In the upper right, I'm going to click on Add Instance. This will bring up a wizard, which will walk through and select our template and other characteristics for our virtual machine. So we'll create the virtual machine through a template. We'll leave that selected. And then we'll choose the particular template that we would like to use, which in our case will just be the template that we recently created. So I'll go over to My Templates. Here it is. I'll select it and click on the Next button. I just have a single compute offering. This is the one I used for my previous virtual machine. I'll leave this selected and click on Next. I could select a disk offering to create a data disk with, but I'm not going to do that here. Let's click on the Next button. We can skip Affinity, Network, and SSH key pair. Let's give this virtual machine a name, maybe something like VM XS-2, and I'll click on the Launch VM button. So right now, CloudStack is going through its orchestration logic, trying to figure out if it has the resources with which to create this virtual machine. It's going to see that the compute offering I selected has a particular storage tag that can only be satisfied by one of my 3 primary storages, and that's the primary storage that's backed by the SolidFire storage plugin. So that is the primary storage that will be selected. CloudStack will start invoking functionality on that plugin, part of which will lead to the creation of a brand new volume on the SolidFire system with a certain size and performance characteristics. In fact, let's go ahead and take a look at the SolidFire system right now. I'll hit the refresh button, and we can see that we do have a new volume. So CloudStack is just picking, so root 12 was the name of the root disk for the previous virtual machine. Now we're on root 13. As we'd expect, we're in the same SolidFire account as these other 2 volumes because we've initiated all of these actions from the same CloudStack account. And again, we're in the same XenServer cluster, so we would expect the volume access group to be the same on all 3 of these SolidFire volumes. If I go over to volume access groups, we can see from another view that we, of course, we still have our 2 XenServer hosts in this volume access group, and that we also have our 3 SolidFire volumes that we would expect, which are in fact the only 3 SolidFire volumes at this time that are in existence on this particular cluster. I'll go ahead and click on Active Volumes again. So we can see everything is in order, including, if I go over to Quality of Service. Now, I didn't really delve into this, but the quality of service was set within our compute offering, and everything looks good here. So we're good to go from the SolidFire point of view. If we go over to XenCenter, we can see that there is, in fact, a new shared storage repository that's visible. I'll go ahead and click on it. Oh, I just missed it. This one here. And if I select the storage tab, we should see there's a single virtual disk image within it. It's the root disk for VM, this one here, I-2-13-VM. I'll go ahead and select that one and switch over to its storage tab. And we can see from this point of view, it only has a single virtual disk that it's making use of, its root disk. We could go ahead and add additional data disks if we decided to later. We could have created a single data disk with it up front through the wizard and then added on additional data disks later as well. But for the time being, this particular virtual machine just has a single disk, its root disk. And if we look at the storage repository, we can see here, I'll go ahead and highlight it. And this storage repository is on our newly created SolidFire volume with its own performance characteristics. So everything looks good here. If we go over to CloudStack, let me select my browser again and click on CloudStack's GUI. We can see here our virtual machine is up and running. Let's take a look at the notifications section. Scroll to the bottom. Add instance was successful.